our members to tell that story and go out to people and say, look, this is the organization we're with, and these are the reasons why we're in this organization, and we believe in what they're doing. That's a very powerful message. So yes, I think I think you have to harness that, and I would again challenge all the members, as you have, Rick, to go out and tell that story of LSO and get people involved. Again, the more resources we have, the more we can do with them. And right now we're relatively small organization, limited resources, but we're large in representation. So we need to leverage that.
Why don't you run a contest? Somebody gets recognized at your next meeting.
That's a great idea.
And whoever brings the most members in gets their name in the paper.
I like that. I like that. That's a good challenge. Go and get members, everyone.
But there is a challenge to us too. We need, if we're going to do that, we need to provide the information to our members that we want out, and that would make it easier for people to do that.
Yeah, when we've tried to get as much information onto our website as possible. We launched our new website last January, and the focus really was around the dissemination of information and the sharing of information, and ensuring that our communications were more robust, whether it's through email, whether it's through social media, and whether it's through our website or YouTube feed. So we have come a long way in communications, but I think where we fall down a little bit is in the on-the-ground outreach to the various communities and clusters across Ontario. And we still have a ways to go with that, so we need to leverage our partnerships across Ontario and using technology as well.
I think that's a key point too, especially with regards to the mentorship committee, looking at more web-based technologies to break the barrier of being GTA centric, so that we can reach across the province and provide and demonstrate the value that we do deliver for our members. I think is a key priority for us as well.
Keith.
LSO, I was on the website about a week or so ago, and there were, I think, 4 policy positions. They're all federally directed, and I think fundamentally I appreciate the direction the organization is going, more policy focused, but it hasn't been so much in the past. I appreciate this consultative process that involves many people has yet to take place, but I wonder if the panel members can each give us some insights into what they might consider to be their top 1 or 2 policy directives that they would like to champion in the context of this new effort.
Well, I'll take that one first if you want. I come from the ag, food, and bioeconomy space. So within that space, we don't have a whole lot of the sector engaged in life sciences in Ontario. So your comment is very germane to what we need to do. We need to identify those policies for the ag sector. And when you go back to all of the sectors, a lot of the challenges are the same. Fiscal policy, the ability for entrepreneurs to raise money, that's the same challenge in the pharma side as it is in the bioeconomy space, as it is in the ag and food space. So if you have an entrepreneur, I'm working with a company right now called Trollbridge Creek, and they have a maple sweet water made from maple sap. What's their key issue? Access to capital, access to markets, right? So does that sound familiar to anybody else in a different sector? Of course it does. So those would be 2 right off the top. Regulatory policy, intellectual property protection, those are all policies that impact our space. And for us, it's anything to do with the commercial side of things, commercialization of innovation is a key challenge for us.
My background has always been within the sort of the pharma device traditionally sector. So as all companies, you're always worried about pipeline and innovation, and I think there's a disconnect right now in that for the small company that there are so many hurdles and barriers in order to actually bring a product to the market. And from our point of view, it is very, very difficult to find a product in late stage that is actually accessible to us. So there seems to be this gap where we need to find a way to bring the two parties together so that we can help drive innovation to the market in a more efficient manner, and that we, from an industrial side, that we have access to some of the great new technologies that are in early stage.
So to add to that, I guess, is it goes back a lot to, I think, access to capital, for the smaller companies to be able to develop their products enough so the large companies might want to look at them, because the large companies do need to see some evidence that it is going to be useful and helpful to them. So I think that's one thing I think we will continue to talk about, and it's both a federal and a provincial, but there's certainly a provincial aspect to that, and within policy around that are using some of the methods to drive innovation through the system by using, I'll make the statement, using procurement, for example, to help drive innovation. So I think that's an area that could be looked at. I think whether this is an LSO thing or not an LSO thing, but it's a sector thing, is we need to look at our culture of entrepreneurship and commercialization. I work across the spectrum, but spend most of my time now with the academic transitioning to translation piece. And our culture's not quite built there to recognize the great entrepreneurs. And the other thing that, frankly, we need to continue to help is this idea of serial entrepreneurs, and it leads into this mentorship piece, trying to connect people who haven't done it before but want to do it before with the people who've done it again and again and again. And the serial part of that is good. It's okay if they, did it great once and didn't do it great twice and did it great again, because in actual fact they probably know more than anybody else. And I think we have a bit of a lack in there of having this access to some of these serial entrepreneurs. So looking across the spectrum about how we can use policy to help look at those areas. Not all of them are policy driven, of course, but that's, I think, important.
So I'll emphasize the market access part. Procurement is part of market access. So when you have new pharmaceuticals that are developed, they have to get on the list in Ontario, right? They have to do that before they can be used. We have a similar issue in the wine sector, where we have really one major seller of alcohol in this province. That's the LCBO. So for a small winery to get into the LCBO, it's almost impossible, right? Some do it very well, but you have to meet certain production quantities, and there's a whole bunch of characteristics that have to be met. So it's the challenge for those small wineries is they can only sell their product either from their location or through to restaurants and that type of thing. The LCBO will take a huge cut of whatever they sell, even though they may not handle the product at all, right? It's just the way the rules are written. So we need to have more favorable policy for the entrepreneur in a lot of different areas.
So I want to make one comment to your question, Keith, and you referenced the papers that were on the website that were federally directed, and that's absolutely true. We do work with many of our partners at a federal level. You'll notice that many of those papers were co-authored papers with Quebec and others directed at some federal policy issues. We actually do more work on provincial advocacy, but that doesn't come across on the website. As you raised that, it got me thinking about it and why that was. And I think the reason is that our advocacy with the province is more of a conversation than it is with the federal government. We have sort of a better working relationship, more access with the province, and so a lot of the conversations don't take place through correspondence, formal correspondence like they do with the federal government in terms of policy responses. They're actual face-to-face meetings with members, with representatives of our board and our organization. But I do think we need to do a better job of communicating those conversations to our members. So that, I think, is a good point to raise.
Certainly greater public sharing, and obviously this is a public-facing document. You'll have lots of discussion, and I was forward certainly hearing what the outcome of that discussion is. But government's often hungry for ideas and direction, and
the extent that LSO can participate in that, certainly government would appreciate the help.
Next question? Oh, we see hands over here. Tom will go first. Oh, we'll go back over here.
Okay, so we've heard stories about the investment that Cisco is planning to make in the province over the last couple of weeks, and the promised 1,700 jobs that's going to bring with it. And around that, there's been some policy discussions publicly and in government about, okay, we want to create the environment in Ontario, and that goes to tax rates and everything. And I guess I was thinking, in the life sciences sector, as far as the advocacy role that you want to play as LSO, there are broad things that are going to appeal to across your membership, and that is going to be a really important part of, I think, the effort to influence governments going forward, especially our own Ontario government. But I also wonder if part of the piece of engaging CEOs, which is another thing you mentioned, Jason, if part of that involves working through them to their global entities to say, hey, Ontario is a great place to invest, and maybe even linking them with provincial government officials to say, let's bring some of that action here.
Absolutely, I think that's critical, and certainly that's when we start looking at things like the Bio International Conference, that's oftentimes a big focus for the province. It's something that we help facilitate, is making those connections between the local entities and the multinational offices. So we work with all of our partners and our multinational members to help facilitate those. The Cisco investment's an interesting one. I've got to be careful on how I tread on this, because I was actually involved with the original Cisco deal when I was with the ministry. And I'm a bit of two minds, because I've got my personal political opinions on direct versus indirect investments. But what I can say is that within that particular company, when I was dealing with them, they were actually a great company to work with. They stood out in my mind, and I had a lot of confidence in their ability to deliver. So I've heard a lot of negativity around the announcement of the investment, but I actually think it's probably a good thing in the end of the day to attract those multinational investments. There's a lot of spin-off to them. Now, at the same time, I believe in creating a strong business environment. So again, my personal politics versus my experience in government is, I'm a little bit torn on this, but I think there's some middle ground there. I mean, the Science and Technology Innovation Council of Canada met with the National Biotech Accord in Ottawa that I was part of late last year, and they were talking about changing over to more direct investment programs, like what you would see in Cisco as an example of the direct investment programs, because they saw that Canada comparatively in OECD countries had an enormous amount of indirect investment. But I actually think the best programs are somewhere in between, right? You take a look at Massachusetts. They have a program that is based on a competitive tax incentive. That sounds kind of weird, a competitive tax incentive. What's that? That essentially is like our direct funding programs, except it's issued through a tax incentive, but they compete for it based on investment, jobs, R&D, so on and so forth. And they have their dedicated $1 billion life sciences fund for which they aggregate portions of this out. And then there are things like the SBIR that leverages procurement dollars, right, to directly invest into companies and SMEs. So there's great examples of programs and policies that probably fall somewhere in between direct and indirect investment. And I always find that those probably tend to be the most effective ones. But that's my opinion.
To add to that, you're absolutely right. Many, especially in the area that we work in, most of the research development investments or funding is driven from a global office, wherever that global office is. So we usually connect with the CEOs here with absolutely the goal that it's the global CEOs we want to bring here, which is what we do, or the global R&D people. So, and they're the ones ultimately that are making that investment. So anything we can do to help the CEOs here make Ontario look better to them, because frankly, they don't care, right? They're just going to where the best work is, the global people that they need done. And so it is important for us to engage with the CEOs, not only for LSO to understand so the information advising about us, but absolutely so that we can connect with the bigger community. Because ultimately, Ontario wants to be a global partner for all of these, and there's places where we can show that, but there's lots of places where we've got a lot of work to do. So you're absolutely right, it's a two-way street with that CEO advisory council for sure.
And the other part is that we need to leverage the resources that we have in this country that we can take advantage of. One would be DFAID, Foreign Affairs and International Trade, offices around the world. And I know one example, there was a company I met with from France, a very large natural health products company that was coming to North America, and they'd already made their decision to go to Massachusetts, interestingly. And I asked them, well, what are you looking for? They said, we're looking for food processing, we're looking for nutrigenomics, and we're looking for expertise in probiotics. And we have all of that in Southern Ontario. Why didn't they come here? Oh, we didn't know you had that, right? So we need to tell the story better.
I think we had a question over here.
Yeah, Jason, you mentioned that the unemployment rate amongst new grads is about 20%. And that doesn't startle me. In fact, I think it's much worse than that because of the 80% remaining, if you go in and look at those numbers to calculate how many people are actually underemployed or not in full-time positions or not in a career path, for example, that they were trained to be in, this is actually devastating. And I've actually approached local politicians here about this situation because, again, it's a looming crisis, and you can see what's happening in Quebec with the high tuition costs, the debt, students really coming out with a dead-end career. And I think this really has to be the focus, especially for this organization, is to find mechanisms where people aren't just cycling through postdoc after postdoc and really get out into industry. And I think the problem is industry hasn't created those jobs here. And I think this is really the tragedy that's befalling a lot of Canada, actually.
Yeah, I really genuinely believe that there is a policy gap. That's the way I can describe it. And the policy gap is that for the last 10 or 20 years plus, we have been promoting higher education, and we have the highest educated young workforce in the world, right? We've got the skilled talent here. But what we haven't been doing is developing, as John and Allison and Pat were talking about earlier, the emphasis on the commercialization of technologies, the creation of homegrown companies that can accept this talent and bring this talent in and grow it here in Canada and Ontario specifically. So I really think there needs to be some policy shifts and emphasis on these knowledge-based sectors. It's a tough sell in Ontario. We've been an auto-based industry. There's been more movement into the IT space. That seems to be a little bit more accessible, I think, in terms of the technologies and concepts and the timelines. Life sciences is a tough sell, and I always find it striking because the biggest budget item on the province is healthcare, right? And to me, the solution to the healthcare issue is innovation, right? So we need to invest in innovative companies in the life sciences space. They can help with all of these challenges, including youth unemployment. So it's all connected into the policies, but really it's an emphasis on the sector as a whole, and I think we'll see the outcomes for our young scientists.
I get the distinct impression, because I've had my meetings with the Ministry of Research and Innovation, in fact, from the inception of that ministry. And I get the impression, the one voice was very important, heard that right at the beginning, there were too many groups. But the other thing was, I got the distinct impression that, again, more science, more technology leads to more cost. And they're not, going there quite yet, because the budgets aren't there to do this. And this is like a formidable thing to get over with the government, is that the more therapeutics we develop, the more capabilities, the more cost it is in a public healthcare system.
Yeah, and again, that's I think is where the policy gap takes place, is they're viewing the sector as a cost center because of the money that's being put into basic research, into the healthcare system, and then they want to see the similar economic benefits out of the end. And from our perspective in LSO, one of the things that I want to do, and it's linked to that Patel Bio benchmarking study, bio in the US, when Sarah Radcliffe was here at our fall event, she said something that struck me. They put a lot of emphasis on their average salaries and the quality of the jobs that they produce. We haven't focused as much on that. I mean, when you look at government announcements like the Cisco job, for instance, right? What do you hear? You hear 1,700 jobs in Ontario. What you don't hear about is that those are really high quality software engineering jobs, you know, blah, 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 you know, like the quality of the jobs. Same with like an auto investment, right? They're all about that number in that catchphrase. And I think we have to put more emphasis on the quality. And given the fact that we have such a highly educated workforce, we've got to focus a little bit more on that.
Jason, can I add a little bit to that? Because there's all of these things are true, and we all need to be educated, but I want to challenge industry a bit here, because when I got out of my PhD, I knew nothing about industry. And I knocked on the door of a large company and said, hey, wonder what you did here, because I had figured out I didn't want to stay in academics. And they took a chance on me, and they gave me a job. I didn't have to prove I had 5 years of experience. I didn't have to prove. They mentored me and they taught me what I needed to know. I talked to lots and lots of people. You look at most jobs, we want this experience, that experience. If you talk to students who are around here, they will tell you the same thing. We all want the perfect employee to walk in the door and start right away and create value. And I'm not saying that all of those other issues that we haven't talked about are important. They're very important. I think co-op is an incredibly important thing. And I challenge more industries. I can tell you I've got 2 kids in that situation, and the co-op jobs are drying up in the system. There are not co-op jobs. So while I'm here and have the podium, I really challenge industry to think. Of course, if you want a VP or something, don't hire someone who's never done anything. But look at the range of jobs and really think about, is it something that you could hire a new grad into that you can give them the experience? How else are they ever going to get it? So I challenge industry a bit here. I think industry is a place to play. I think we're all on tight margins, so we don't want to take the risks but people took risks on most of us. And you know, I turned out to almost now entirely spend my time on that, and I will be honest, it was Connaught at the time. If they had not taken that chance on me, who knows what, you know, those kinds of things. So I would challenge all of you to think about that when you're hiring.
See, I'm going to do the reverse challenge. I'll challenge the students out there to think, if you're in a path that you're doing a pharma program, for example, don't think that you just have to end up in pharma, because life sciences is way more broad than that. When you look at undergraduates coming out of the University of Guelph, for example, there are 3 jobs for every graduate. Right? 3 jobs. Right? So think beyond what your normal training is, because the training is valuable. The best experience you're going to get, however, will come from the industry. So that will be transferable.
And I do agree with Allison, but the other challenge that industry is facing is that because of the constraints in capacity, or constraints on capacity internally, you simply do not have time to allow someone to get to break even, to get to that point where they start to deliver value 6 to 12 months after hire. And the market is so competitive right now that you're almost forced to saying, who is the person that I can bring into my organization that I can trust, because that person is going to have more ability to influence than in the past. And it's a very difficult.
Yeah. We're in a catch-22,
Yeah,
right? Because now industry's saying we don't have enough skilled people. Students are saying, well, I don't have the skill yet, but I have the basics. So we're in a bit of a catch-22. So for sure you can't do it with everything. But that's why I like the co-op program too, where companies can, and again, it depends, where you can do that, then at least you're giving them those options. But I ran a program that was purely dedicated to getting us, like it was a post-degree program, 1-year program. And this is the other thing that I would suggest you do, if you're really interested, I can give you more information afterwards, but I had an industry advisory council that helped devise the curriculum for the program. And so even though the students weren't in industry, they were getting curriculum that had been designed by industry, so when they went out, they could talk to industry. So there are different ways to do these kinds of things, but there is a real problem, and we really need to work through the whole set from education all the way through.
So I think this is an important topic, and I want to add one final thought to it. We have a great relationship with BioTalent Canada, and they issued their labor market survey, which we sponsored last year. The two outcomes, the biggest challenges for industry employing young graduates were, one, resources, money, and two, soft skills of those people, right? So obviously they have the basic skills and training. One of the programs that BioTalent offered that we endorsed and supported was their career focus program, where new graduates would be subsidized up to 20 grand. So if you're an industry company, you're looking to hire a new graduate, you can get 20 grand of their salary paid. I believe that's going to be renewed. Ontario was the largest user of that program by far. So I thought that was a good indicator as well.
I wanted to raise the point that when companies actually set up operations here like Cisco or any other company, that they will hire internationally. This is a key point. They won't necessarily draw from the pool of people that are within Ontario or Canada. And one of the disturbing things we recently learned is that in fact on the academic side, many of the large grant awardees have no Canadians in training in their laboratory. They in fact have very few Canadian employees in their laboratory. So this is one of the things that was a shock to my local MP when I put him in front of a grant award winner, that he had found a way to basically stock his lab with foreign nationals, basically because those governments will pay their stipend to come and do research in the laboratory here in Canada. So this is also a problem, is that people will always find ways of getting around doing this and doing that, and then, you know, we end up with a real disconnect there.
Okay, so I'm going to, there's another question at the back of the room there.
Just a quick comment.
Mm-hmm.
Just a quick comment. The recent.
I can hear you.
We're good?
Yeah.
All right, there we go. As a recent graduate, I think I can certainly sort of reflect and comment on Allison's point. I think, you know, there's a job to be done to filling the gap. I mean, it's always going to be important to train the best bench scientists, but if these people aren't getting exposure to the business community, to commercialization processes, to business while they're in school, then they're coming out, you know, very focused. And if we're saying we don't quite need all of that, and they need a little more exposure, then we need to start doing a better job of rounding these people out. So anyways, my point was around sort of market expansion and awareness. Jason, you talked a bit about how sort of each of the quartiles and how we're going after that. It's a pretty wide umbrella, I think, that we cover. And we're also fairly GTA, like you said, sort of focused right now. There's 10, 12, I think, major sort of city centers that you identified. Is there a plan or sort of pathway that you see going forward in the next year to 3 years? I mean, in 3 to 5 years, we could probably hit all those, and we could, you know, really push out. But you know, where are we focusing in the next year? Where are we focusing in the next 2 years, both from a city standpoint, but also from a sort of industry standpoint?
It's a great question. I think we already have some strengths in various clusters around the province through our partnerships, right? So we are aligned with folks like you know, the Sustainable Chemistry Alliance in Sarnia, Simtech in London. In Ottawa, there's a lot of the national organizations like BioTalent Canada and RX&D. And so, you know, we've got those linkages throughout the province with many of our partners. And so we need to leverage those, I think, a little bit more. We have representation on our board from across the province, including Thunder Bay. One of the things that we want to do, which I talked about in our strategic plan, is leverage technology to better disseminate information. So the first thing is to make sure that people in these communities are aware that LSO even exists, right? That's still a challenge for us, right? So we need to get the messaging and the information out there and leverage technology. I think that's the low-hanging fruit. The tougher one is getting people on the ground engaged in LSO and what we're doing within these communities. And that's really where you need to leverage, again, those partnerships and move those forward. So For us, I think the low-hanging fruit is dissemination of information and engagement in LSO activities, utilizing technology. I think that's the first thing to do. And then the next thing to do is get more engagement, on-the-ground engagement in those communities. That takes a little bit more resources. Any thoughts on that from the committee?
I was just going to say, so one example is we're looking at doing satellite breakfasts. So, should we be doing a breakfast in Thunder Bay, one in Ottawa, one in London? We clearly can't travel to all of those places, but, so for example, Tech Alliance in London is already an organisation that we could do an event with and have talked about. So we're looking at doing those kind of partnering events, which would be an LSO breakfast partnered with them, and so that we can do those kinds of things. So that's the first stage kind of for kind of this kind of breakfast thing to get out there. We have talked about doing web casting of the breakfasts. We're still working on that a little bit, not because it's technically we can do the webcast from here. It's making sure we've got connections elsewhere, and if you can web archive so they can watch them. If you really want a webcast, then you want them to be accessible for them to ask questions. So the technology bit we're still working on a little bit with our partners, but those are the kinds of things we're trying to do just at bare minimum to get people to understand who we are and what we're doing. And I think we did a pub night already over in London. I can't remember.
Yeah, we did a simultaneous
kind of
pub night where we did it in 3 jurisdictions in Ottawa, London, and Toronto, and so that was an interesting one that we piloted as well. So we're continuing to explore those options.
We also did the Biogenius Challenge,
Yeah.
right? So in Hamilton and London.
Yeah.
I would just say Hamilton as well. I mean, you think of HHS, your St. Joe's, your
Yeah.
Innovation Factory, McMahon. I mean, huge hub and little to no activity so far.
Well,
So the middle of May there'll be a breakfast in Hamilton,
Perfect.
and we did a